So today is Friday the 17th of February 2012 and I'm here in the Museum of Jurassic Technology with David Wilson. Thank you very much for meeting me.
Entirely my pleasure.
Oh, that's good to hear. So David, maybe you could say a little bit about your journey. I mean, did you have an arts training to start with?
No, I did not. I did not have arts training. My undergraduate work was in natural sciences, essentially. Well, really biology. I went to a school in Michigan primarily to work with a biologist who was doing work that I thought was interesting when I was in high school. It was work having to do with really what became known as punctuated equilibrium. It was that Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard ultimately became quite well known for putting into the world. This fellow that I was working with, Donald Townsend at Kalamazoo College, actually was doing that work a number of years before Stephen Gould. But at any rate, I went to work with him. He was the draw, and I worked for 4 years in that vein and loved it. It was wonderful, but decided after I finished the undergraduate work that really this wasn't my life's calling, and I could see myself working for 20 years in someone else's laboratory and not having the kind of life that I really had imagined. So I simply went into the world for a period of time. My wife and I moved to rural western Colorado. We built a home, and we began doing work that I had begun in college, which was film work, motion picture work. We were making television commercials for anyone that would have us, and things for chambers of commerce. And we decided to get good at what we were doing, so we came to California to go to California Institute of the Arts to learn how to make films better, and did that. In the first month after moving to Colorado, we had built a house in rural western Colorado, and the person we loaned it to burned it to the ground, so we had nothing to go back to, so we stayed here. And so for many, many years I was on this kind of unproductive path of trying to balance these two interests, one of which was interest in natural science, biology, natural history on the one hand, and presentation through motion picture or other means on the other. And I tried actually a number of things. I tried making scientific films in the vein of Oxford Scientific, which are a group that I'm sure you're aware of, who do beautiful work, and it was a complete disaster, just absolutely led nowhere. I had a good time, but it wasn't very promising until one day it just occurred to me that more than anything in the world I wanted to, essentially build a museum, have a museum. I had loved museums the whole of my life, and my earliest I remember my first kind of sense of an epiphany was actually in the Science Museum in London. I was, I think, 6 to 8 years old, and I remember being in this space and just being filled with the most wonderful sense of awe that I still remember, now. And so I sought out museums my whole young life. I would go with a friend who was of the same persuasion to all the museums. And I grew up in Denver, Colorado, which isn't a large city, especially at that time, but for a city its size, it had wonderful museums. And so we spent our weekends, every weekend, in these museums, and they were inexplicably meaningful to me. So then this notion of having a museum, when it finally came to consciousness, was, I just felt absolutely right. And
Was it always important to you to build your own museum, right, as opposed to working in another museum?
It actually never really occurred to me to work in another museum. I think that, and I'm not certain why that was, but well, I did not have that training, I realized, and by this time I was deeply into my 30s. If I bloomed at all, I was at what they call a late bloomer, and I wasn't about to go back to school to get a degree in conservation or something. So it just, I don't know, it never really occurred to me to work in another museum.
And that drive, you described it a moment ago as it just occurred to me one day. I think you said, was it like that? Was it like this epiphany in the way that you describe it?
It actually was. I mean, I think that things like this happen in, many, many people's lives, but where kind of material is being processed under the surface. And I think that all of these thoughts, I had been churning on this kind of dichotomy for a decade or more, this kind of love of natural history but love of putting things into the world. But I wasn't conscious in any way of where that was really leading, or the things I was conscious of weren't really what was happening. And then just one day it erupted. We had a workshop, with a shop with, table saws and with tools. And I was in the shop one Saturday morning, and it just occurred to me. I had built a case to keep the dust off some electronics, and I placed it over these other objects, and it looked like a display case. And then I just opened up this tidal wave, this absolute tidal wave, and for 3 hours was just writing as fast as I could write, and it took me 5 years to kind of complete all the ideas that I had that one morning, in that short amount of time.
I wanted to talk to you about that. Maybe I'm going to jump ahead a bit and ask you about that now, because there is everything in the Museum of Jurassic Technology is incredibly, painstakingly well presented.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And there's an amount of time that it takes to do that, from the origin of the initial idea to that point of presentation, a public presentation. Is the work, can you still make work in that process, or in that process are you just fulfilling that initial idea that you had?
The initial idea.
You said it took you 5 years.
Right. And there were ideas for exhibits that I wanted to create that it took me 5 years to do. That was now almost 30 years ago. So those ideas were long ago completed, but the same kind of, the process changes, of course, but it's similar, but things, you're right, things here do take us arduously long to complete often. It's not uncommon for an exhibit between the idea and the presentation to be 5 years, or sometimes more. 5 years is kind of a norm for us at this point. But
so the question's really then about how you stick with that, or whether or not does that, because I suppose especially in a kind of contemporary culture, if you need to get that.
I don't know if I need to get it, but I need to turn off my telephone. That's what I need to do.
It's a very inoffensive ring, at least.
Right.
Things that move so quickly, and certainly a lot of artists that identify themselves as artists, we'll maybe talk about that a bit later,
right.
But they will have an idea, they'll get somebody else to make it, because once they've had the idea, in a way, the work is done. So my question is really about, where does the work lie for you? Is it both in the idea, generation of the idea, and in the fabrication of it?
Oh yeah, definitely,
okay.
definitely.
So there is a thing, it's not just a cerebral thing, it's about a physical, dealing with materials.
It's at least 50% about, it's more than that, because really I believe so much just in my life in watching the work of all kinds of people. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this, I think, will inevitably have to talk about this, but I mean, I'm not positive what distinguishes an artist from other people, really. But the thing that I know is among people who produce things and put them into the world, the ones whose work is most meaningful to me are the people where the process of the work is, a very living thing, where it's not simply as you say, cerebrally based, but really you can just feel when the process of the construction or the fabrication is as an important or oftentimes more important part of the of the process.
So how do you describe the Museum of Jurassic Technology?
We'll say, I mean, it's funny how you get these boilerplates, these things that you say. I was noticing that earlier with you, that you have your boilerplates and you just lay them out there, and that's fine because you have to do it. But our boilerplate for the museum is that we're a museum that's inspired by the history of the institution of the museum. I think all museums are really, but we're very conscious of being inspired by the history of the institution of the museum. We look back, not necessarily in all ways, but in some ways, to the origins of the institution when a museum was not so specifically focused on one area of interest, but was museums were simply encyclopedic. They were museums of many, many things where works of art would be presented next to, anatomical anomalies or biological, things of biological interest, and that's kind of the model that's been for our museum. So we describe our museum as a museum of natural history, history of science, history of art, ethnography, and as we come up with new exhibits, we just add to the list,
Over this process, so it's 30 years, is it?
Well, since actually 1984 was the absolute beginning, so it's not quite, more like 28 years, I guess.
Over that period of time, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you was the longevity of this project, which is quite unique, it seems to me. Well, one thing about the Museum of Jurassic Technology, it seems to me, is that it seems to value doubt in some way, or it sees our value in doubt in some way.
I think it's a nice way of describing it.
How about your relation to the museum as a worker, if you like? Have you encountered doubt across this project from that first epiphanic moment?
Right. Doubt as in, well, I mean, when we opened the museum, which was, well, the museum, I mean, just a little history quickly. The museum was an itinerant institution for about the first 4 years of its existence. And in 1988, we decided that it was time to bring, the museum to the people rather than loading it up in trucks, or that it was time to bring people to the museum rather than loading it up in a truck and taking it someplace and taking the museum to the people. So we found this space and opened after an incredibly long period of time, renovating what was a small section of the current museum. We finally, after about 9 months of preparation, opened to the public, not knowing if anybody would ever come to the museum, and for the longest time, nobody did come to the museum. I mean, no one would come. I would stand out front, and I played then accordion, and I play similar instruments now, and I would stand out front trying to drum up business, and it's not a heavily trafficked area, and I mean, we were open then Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, and if we had 10 people over that period of time, it was cause for celebration. It was very, very, very rough going. So is that doubt? I don't know. I mean, I kept the for lease sign because I was sure that we would just have to give up, and that it would save the cost of having to buy another for lease sign. But somehow that's not doubt. I never doubted the need to do this work. I mean, there wasn't doubt of that kind. It was just horrendous doubt of whether or not we'd have enough money to pay the next month's rent. And that, I mean, to a certain extent continues until today, but, fortunately, thankfully, less so than it was. It was for just years and years and years, absolutely month to month, or kind of week to week,
So doubt was attached maybe to the kind of practical...
Exactly, aspects.
But never to the...
Actually not, really. Which I don't know. I guess maybe that's just really fortuitous, but the material that we are able to present is so compelling and so interesting and so wonderful, and the process is so nourishing. What's to doubt?
So as you know, this series of interviews that I'm conducting for this project is around the notion of kind of the artist as leader. Are you comfortable with that term, artist?
Wonderfully comfortable with the term artist, but I don't know. But I don't have a clue what that means. I mean, I assume that when people say, "Oh, you're an artist," it means in some way that you're good at what you do, and that sounds nice. But I mean, I really, I sincerely am not at all certain what is the distinction between an artist and other people. I mean, it is an artist a person who does what they do with, a particular kind of attention and skill and devotion? Is that what makes an artist? Or, I mean, what's the difference between an artist and anyone who makes things? I guess, as you were saying earlier, maybe artists don't even really have to make things. They can just have ideas, I suppose. And so I've never thought of myself as an artist. And I don't think that, there are people working in the museum from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life. There are artists among us, among the group, but not predominantly at all.
I mean, maybe the possibility of the term artist in relation to you is
right.
that it isn't easy to fix,
right?
And maybe that is maybe you can be a beneficiary of the term in that respect to some degree.
How do you mean easy to fix?
It seems to me that, you are described in the kind of publicity of the museum as the museum director.
Right.
But you do more than direct the museum.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me.
Right.
That the Museum of Jurassic Technology is, if one thinks of it on a kind of meta level, is a work of which you are the author in some way. I'm not saying that it's not a collaboration, there aren't other people involved.
It's enormously collaborative, right.
But so that would be the same, in my regard, for any arts practice.
Yeah. I don't object to the term at all.
No.
But it's a very sincere question on my part. What is that distinction? And is it maybe more valuable to leave the gray areas larger and more gray and bleeding more, and having more kind of bleed over? I think that I'm far more comfortable when things are a little less precisely defined, which I don't think should change the nature of our conversation.
No, if anything, I would entirely concur on my own behalf. I feel quite uncomfortable using the term often myself. And I think that's to do, and maybe this is helpful, with the certain kinds of preconception that come with that term. It's quite a loaded term in many respects.
Yeah.
Could you talk maybe a minute about the audience for the Museum of Jurassic Technology? You talked about those first years, you playing the accordion on the street to drum up.
Any audience. Business, yeah, and over time, some folks would trickle in. Mostly, and at that time in those early days, some people would find us that would write, and the writing just in kind of the normal local papers, which were the kind of free papers and that started to drum up a little bit more attendance, and then there was really most of our attendance has been from word of mouth, because we're not in a position, nor do we believe in doing publicity, so we don't do publicity of any kind. But so it's mostly, I think, been through word of mouth that people hear about us, which is great. And so over time, more and more people came until today we have our attendance is just fine. We couldn't really handle much more than we have, and it's in a kind of a good place of equilibrium. The people that come to the museum are from all different backgrounds. We'll have the Getty Fellows, which is this high prestige, maybe like the grant you received, but it's a high perceived group of of scholars, and they come pretty much every year, but just as likely, the folks that work down the street at In-N-Out Burger, they'll stop here on their way home. It's just all kinds of folks. It's everybody and anybody, and we love that. That's exactly how we had hoped from the beginning it would be.
And how do you feel about the way that it has kind of gathered this, I'm loath to use the word cult, but it has got a certain kind of international status. I knew about the Museum of Jurassic Technology long before I ever got here.
Yeah.
And it's kind of talked about in a certain kind of a way, certainly in art circles and museum circles.
Yeah.
Do you relish that?
I don't really know very much about that, actually, because nobody talks. We're not in the room when people are having that conversation. So really, there isn't much. We in the world of museums, which there have been groups, it seems, from our perspective. This is just looking at it through a particular keyhole that we have, but it seems that there have been, in terms of groups of people, as I was saying earlier, it's all kinds of folks that end up here for whatever wonderful reason. We're happy they're here, but there have kind of been three groups that come to mind that have maybe talked about us more within the group, and those would be the sciences. There has been quite a bit of, we get visitorship from people in the sciences. We get visitorship specifically or from people in the museum world, and then from people in the art world, that like you're describing. And each of those, or participants in each of those groups, tend to see our work in a very particular light, of course, as they would. In museums, we kind of came into existence coincidentally with a movement that took place, or a kind of an effort in the larger world of museums that was described as the crisis of the museum in the digital age, which, museums have began to wonder 20 years ago, what's the purpose, what's the place of a museum in a culture where information is available today. It wasn't 20 years ago, but you have more information available on the telephone in your pocket than you could possibly ever receive by going to a museum. So what's the point of a museum? A museum has always been a place where you went, at least one of its purposes, to gather information, to learn about things, and you can learn about things in many, many ways now, and much more quickly and likely easier. So I can't remember exactly where I was heading with this, but what did you ask?
I was asking about the kind of reputation.
Oh, right.
I mean, the way in which it's talked about, that it's become a kind of thing.
Yeah, and so we hear about that. We know about that. I've been, personally, I get invited to these conferences. I remember actually once, I can't think what it's called, but the British Organization of Museums, like the AAM, American Association of Museums, there's a British
MLA?
version. Maybe it's the MLA. And I received a letter asking me to be the keynote speaker on the island of Jersey for the meeting of the MLA. And there had been a director of the British Museum, also named David Wilson. I was convinced they had their role David Wilson. I was just positive, and actually wrote back and said, thank you for the invitation, but I'm really afraid I'm not who you think I am. And they wrote back and said, no, we know who you are, and we would like for you to give a keynote speech at the MLA. So I went, and I did. I think really in the long run I was the, I don't know how you say it, I don't want to say the comedic act, but I was like I was a diversion in a way, but it was great. It was a wonderful experience. I met some wonderful people, so we see that there has been attention in various ways, and we're honored. It's wonderful. I don't think it has a lot of direct impact on what we do. I think that we would be doing exactly the same thing that we do all the time, every day anyway. It's very important to us that people come and appreciate what we do, because it's an enormous amount of work, as you know. Any work like this is a lot of work, and you can't do it if you feel that there's nobody that's going to appreciate or perceive the work and then appreciate it on some level in some way. So, we're happy that there are people that respond to what we do.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about leadership.
Okay. Okay. You have all the really hard questions.
Leadership's not. People, generally speaking, and don't feel. Well, let me not presume. What do you see yourself as a leader?
It had never occurred to me to think of myself as a leader.
But let me rephrase the question then. Do you observe that what you're doing is exercising leadership?
Let me ask a question. I think that people ask us, what do you want people to leave the museum with? And our boilerplate response is what they make of it, that it's for people to decide, and it's very varied. I think that when we're being most honest, we'd say that we're happiest when people leave inspired. And if, I don't know really how leadership fits into the work that we do, unless you can conceive of conceive of inspiration as a form of leading, you know. And because I know that for me, when I'm inspired by something, by a work of some kind, it leads me, it pulls me forward, it pulls me forward. And that's the only way that I can make sense of the idea of leadership. Another possible way to think about that is that another way that, you know, now looking back over the time that we've been here, another thing that perhaps we've brought to the world kind of inadvertently is essentially an kind of economic statement or an economic offering in the sense that one of the impossibilities as we perceive them now, or as we perceive them then and still perceive them now, in undertaking the project of the museum is its economic impossibility. There's no economic foundation under us, and there never has been. I mean, I worked for many years in the film industry, and that was the sole support, not the sole, but almost sole support of the museum forever. And in other words, it exists against a sense of kind of economic impossibility. And I think that in a certain way as we watch in the culture, and mostly in Los Angeles, maybe other places as well, I think that we have inspired, again, other places or emboldened. We've given people courage, I think, or we've been told by people that we gave them courage to undertake projects that they would not have undertaken. And I think that kind of courage is really valuable. I think of Werner Herzog talking about seeing the movies of Reusch, kind of an anthropological documentarian, and he's saying that seeing those films gave him courage to make his films. And I think, you know, I can think of lots of things that have given me courage, but I think in a certain way that is another, maybe if you look at leadership, you can look at leadership in that way, maybe that's a way as well.
Sorry, I just wanted to say it's 11:20.
Okay, thank you.
Have you an appointment to go to?
I do. It's at 11:30, but we can. I was late. Oh. Well, all right.
I mean, I've been struggling myself for a kind of useful definition of leadership in the context, because there's been so much disavowal of that term by artists.
Yeah.
And my understanding really is that leadership is a kind of creative behavior that is conscious and intentional about change in some way. And it seems to me that arts practices in general, and maybe specifically the Museum of Jurassic Technology, is particular in that regard. That is that it's demonstrating change in a way. I mean, at the very least, that it didn't exist before you led it into the world.
Right. Well, I think that in that sense, yes. I mean, we're very conscious of wanting to create change. I mean, we want to do that on all kinds of levels, in many, many ways. I mean, in those kinds of ways I was talking about, in terms of just culture in general, that basically bootstrapped culture, it's like culture that isn't top down, is possible, and we feel, I mean, we're not the first people to think this, of course, but we're very much in favor of those kinds of efforts. I mean, that kind of change. We're interested in doing our part to usher in a kind of change in, I don't know, this is going to sound overblown, but kind of change in kind of ways of thinking. We believe in, as you brought up earlier, kind of doubt. We believe in the importance of unknowing and uncertainty. We think that, and so, these are kind of our internal, maybe special missions, that without really spending much time consciously thinking about these things, when we look at what we do, this is what we're doing.
I think that's demonstrable from the circulation of the idea of the Museum of Jurassic Technology before I ever came here, but certainly when I came here, that was demonstrable from my experience for me. So I'm conscious of time. I wanted to ask you, you referred throughout this interview to we. You've never once, I think, even when you were talking about your early life, you were talking about we in relation to you and your wife.
Yeah.
And that, I fully understand that, and I appreciate that no work is made in isolation. Nothing is made in isolation. But what I wanted to ask, and I hope you don't think it's impertinent, but what is the Museum of Jurassic Technology without you? And maybe even more, what are you without the Museum of Jurassic Technology?
Yeah, that second question, I can't even think of at this point in my life. And what the Museum of Jurassic Technology is without me, we'll see shortly, So, and, we collectively think about that, and consider that. In the same way that, this is just like genuine experience. In the same way that when we are talking about definitions of, a personal vocation, as in, definitively an artist, as opposed, the way in which the gray areas exist. I think that that's very valuable in terms of understanding bringing things into the world as well. That the merging of minds that takes place in kind of collective, collaborative endeavors is, I feel like that is only acknowledging what's true, what's real, in the sense of an assertion of individual authorship is, I don't know. It just seems disingenuous. It doesn't seem honest, really, is what it comes down to. I think that I remember, because in the earliest days, the ideas for the original exhibits, basically seemed to come in some way from my mind. But the thing that I've discovered over time is that in working with other people is that, and I think that people that make things, put things into the world, all experiences, that ideas, we don't say, I guess you do say, I had an idea, but you can also say, an idea came to me. And ideas, thoughts, notions seem to come from the outside. And when you work with other people, I think it's actually easier to see that, because the ideas seem to appear in the space between two people working on something. So, I don't know, that's kind of talking around what you were asking.
It's beautifully put, and maybe that's on that note of ideas coming. I'd like to thank you very much, David.
Oh, thank you enormously. This was really a great pleasure.